The auctioneer had stopped calling bids. There was no point. The 21 cows stood together in the far pen, their ribs visible beneath dull coats, hips sharp, legs thin, and eyes tired. They looked nothing like the cattle people brought to a livestock sale, hoping to impress buyers. These cows looked like survivors. The auctioneer cleared his throat. Lot 43, 21 head. As is. Silence. A rancher near the front shook his head. Send them to slaughter. Another laughed. They're barely worth hauling. Then 36-year-old Nora Whitmore raised her hand. The auctioneer stared at her. You want the whole lot? Nora nodded. Yes. A few people laughed. She didn't. She was looking at the cows. Not their ribs. Their eyes. They were alert. They were standing. And most importantly, they were still trying to eat. Nora raised her card again. The auctioneer dropped the hammer. Sold. Nora on 180 acres of worn-out pasture in central Missouri. She had inherited the farm from her father 5 years earlier. The land had once been productive, but years of continuous grazing had taken their toll. The grass was thin. Bare soil appeared around the gates. Weeds filled the low spots. Every summer, the pasture turned brown. Nora had tried reseeding. She had purchased fertilizer. She had repaired fences. Nothing seemed to last. Then she began studying regenerative grazing. The idea was simple. Don't force animals to survive on one piece of land. Move them. Give grazed areas time to recover. Keep living roots in the soil. Use animals as part of the system rather than treating them as machines that simply consume grass. It sounded expensive. Nora couldn't afford expensive, so she needed a different approach. When she saw the 21 cows at the auction, she realized they might be the perfect animals for her experiment. They weren't impressive. They weren't young. They weren't heavy. But they were hardy. They had survived poor management. And they were cheap. Very cheap. Nora bought the entire group for less than a single healthy commercial cow would have cost. The man beside her laughed. What are you going to do with those? Give them grass. He laughed again. They need more than grass. Nora looked at him. Maybe they need better grass. The cows arrived at her farm that evening. Nora had prepared a small recovery paddock. Fresh water. High-quality hay. Mineral supplements. Shade. No competition. No long walk. No sudden feed changes. Her veterinarian, Dr. Leah Morgan, examined every animal. Some were severely underconditioned. Several had parasites. 2 had hoof problems. But none were beyond recovery. Dr. Morgan looked at Nora. They'll need time. How much? Months. Nora nodded. That's okay. Dr. Morgan smiled. Most people buying these cows wouldn't have that kind of patience. Nora looked toward the pasture. That's why they were cheap. The first month was about survival. Nora fed them carefully. She treated parasites, trimmed damaged hooves, monitored their weight, and kept detailed records. The cows slowly changed. Their eyes became brighter. Their coats began to shine. They spent more time walking, then grazing, then playing small dominance games like normal cattle. Nora's daughter, Sophie, noticed first. Mom. What? They look less sad. Nora smiled. They're starting to feel safe. But Nora didn't want to keep them in a recovery pen forever. The whole point was to rebuild the land and create a grazing system that could support cattle without constantly buying more feed. So she divided the farm into paddocks. Electric fencing created narrow grazing sections. The cows would spend a short period in one area. Then Nora would move them. The grazed pasture would rest. Grass would recover. Roots would continue feeding soil organisms. The cattle would return later. It was more work. Much more. But Nora believed it could work. The neighbors weren't convinced. One afternoon, her neighbor Earl stopped at the fence. He watched Nora move the cattle into a fresh paddock. You really think those skinny cows are going to improve this place? Nora nodded. I'm hoping they will. Earl laughed. Looks like you're feeding grass to cows that need feed. Nora smiled. That's generally how cattle work. He shook his head. You know what I mean. I do. Earl looked over the field. Your father would have put them on hay. My father didn't have this pasture. Earl raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Nora pointed toward the ground. I'm trying to fix what's underneath it. The first summer was difficult. Rain came late. The grass struggled. Several paddocks recovered slowly. Nora almost ran out of hay, but she kept moving the cows. Short grazing periods. Longer recovery periods. She watched the plants carefully. Instead of waiting for a field to become completely bare, she moved the herd before the grass was exhausted. Then she waited and watched. Something began changing. The grass returned faster. The ground stayed covered longer. Bare patches started disappearing. When rain finally arrived, water soaked into the pasture instead of immediately running downhill. Nora dug small soil samples. The upper layer was beginning to crumble more easily. She found earthworms, more than she had seen in years. Sophie thought it was exciting. "You found worms." Nora laughed. "Those worms are working harder than most people." By the second spring, the difference was visible from the road. The pastures were greener, thicker, more diverse. Clover appeared naturally among the grasses. Wildflowers returned. The cows had changed too. Their ribs were gone. Their backs filled out. Their coats shone. And the 21 animals that had looked destined for slaughter now moved through the pasture like an ordinary healthy herd. Earl stopped his truck one morning. He stared through the fence. "Those the same cows?" Nora smiled. "Every one of them." He looked at the pasture, then at the cows, then back at Nora. "What did you feed them?" Nora pointed down. "That." Earl frowned. "Grass. Healthy grass." He didn't answer. Nora's records showed something even more interesting. The cows were gaining weight while her purchased feed costs were falling. The improved grazing system meant she could keep cattle on pasture longer. The land was producing more forage. And because the cows were moved frequently, no single area was being repeatedly grazed down. Nora wasn't simply rehabilitating cattle. She was rebuilding the relationship between cattle and pasture. Then a severe summer drought hit the county. Neighboring fields turned brown. Pay prices climbed. Several ranchers began selling cattle because they couldn't afford to feed them. Nora's farm struggled too. But her deepest-rooted grasses stayed green longer. Not perfectly green, not magically green, but noticeably better. Her 21 cows kept grazing. And for the first time, people began asking Nora questions instead of laughing. One afternoon, Earl returned. This time he didn't joke. He stood at the fence for several minutes. Then he said, "Nora." She turned. "Yes." "How did you get that pasture to stay green?" Nora looked across the field. "That's the question I've been trying to answer for 2 years." Earl shook his head. "No." He pointed toward the herd. "I think you've already answered it." Earl's words stayed with Nora. For 2 years, she'd been watching the cows. But now, other people were watching too. The drought became the test nobody could avoid. By August, neighboring pastures had turned yellow and brittle. Nora's farm wasn't untouched. Some paddocks were brown. Some grasses had stopped growing. But the areas that had received longer recovery periods remained surprisingly green. The cows moved through them slowly, grazing without stripping the plants to the ground. Nora continued rotating them. She refused to panic. One morning, Earl arrived with 2 other ranchers. They stood at the fence. One pointed toward the pasture. "What's your stocking rate?" Nora told him. He frowned. "That's impossible." "It isn't. How are you keeping that many cattle on this land?" Nora opened her notebook. "Short grazing periods. Long recovery. I watched the plants instead of following the calendar." The rancher looked down at the grass. Then he noticed something. The pasture wasn't just green. It was diverse. Tall grasses grew beside clover and broadleaf plants. The ground remained covered. There were fewer bare patches. And when he dug his boot into the soil, it broke apart instead of forming a hard crust. He looked at Nora. "How long did this take?" 2 years to see it. "And how long until you think it's really established?" Nora smiled. "I'm still learning." The drought continued. Hay prices climbed again. Nora's neighbors began hauling feed. Some reduced their herds. One sold half his cattle. Nora didn't escape the drought completely. She had to buy supplemental hay too. But she needed significantly less than she had expected. The difference wasn't magic. Her pasture had more living roots, more ground cover, more organic matter, and better water infiltration. The cattle were helping cycle nutrients through the land instead of simply removing forage. The system was becoming more resilient. Then came the storm. After months of dry weather, nearly 4 inches of rain fell in a single afternoon. Water poured down the hills. Earl's pasture flooded. Another neighbor lost several inches of topsoil. Nora watched the rain from her porch. Water entered the pasture. But instead of racing downhill, much of it disappeared into the soil. The thick grass slowed the runoff. Roots opened pathways. Organic matter helped hold moisture. The next morning, Nora walked outside. The creek was muddy, but her fields were remarkably intact. She knelt and grabbed a handful of soil. Dark, crumbly, alive. She smiled. That was the moment she knew the experiment had become something permanent. The 21 cows had changed too. They were no longer skeletal. They were mature, healthy animals. Some had become excellent mothers. Several had produced calves that inherited their ability to maintain condition on pasture. Nora began selectively breeding from the strongest females. She didn't try to create enormous cattle. She wanted animals suited to her land. Cows that calved easily, walked well, foraged efficiently, stayed healthy, and maintained body condition without excessive supplemental feed. The original rescue herd had become the foundation of a new breeding program. Word spread. Farmers began visiting from neighboring counties. Some expected a secret fertilizer. Others wanted a special grass seed. One asked what chemical treatment she had used. Nora laughed. None. So what's the secret? She pointed toward the cows. Management. Then toward the pasture. Patience. Earl eventually tried the system himself. He fenced off a portion of his pasture and divided it into smaller paddocks. He moved his cattle more frequently. He rested the grazed areas. At first, he hated it. It takes too much time. Nora laughed. I warned you. But several months later, Earl called. You need to come look. Nora drove over. His pasture wasn't perfect, but the grass was recovering. The ground stayed covered. He had started seeing earthworms again. Earl stood beside her with his hands on his hips. I hate admitting this. Nora smiled. You've done it before. He laughed. Your cows taught you. No. Nora looked toward the pasture. The land did. 3 years after the auction, the story had become almost impossible to recognize. The 21 skeletal cows were now healthy, mature cattle. Their offspring grazed beside them. Nora's pasture was among the greenest in the area, but she never claimed that the cows alone had created it. The transformation came from a system: rest, rotation, living roots, diverse plants, careful stocking, healthy animals, and constant observation. The cattle were part of the solution because Nora learned how to use grazing as a tool rather than simply letting animals consume whatever grass was available. At a county agricultural meeting, Nora was asked to explain her approach. She stood beside a photograph from the auction. 21 thin cows stood behind a metal fence. Then she showed another photograph. The same animals years later. Healthy cattle stood knee-deep in lush pasture. The room became quiet. Nora said, Everyone thought I was rescuing cows. She paused. I was. But I was also rescuing the land. She explained that the cows needed the pasture needed recovery, and the soil needed living plants covering it. Once those pieces worked together, each supported the others. The cattle grazed. They moved on. The plants recovered. Their roots fed the soil held more water, and healthier pastures supported healthier cattle. It was a cycle, not a miracle. After the meeting, Earl approached her. He handed her an old photograph. It showed the auction pen. Nora looked at it and laughed. You kept this? Of course. Why? He smiled. To remind myself how wrong I was. Nora looked at the photograph again. 21 bony cows. No one wanted them. Then she looked through the meeting hall window toward her green fields. Sometimes, she said, people judge the animal before they look at the ground beneath it. That evening, Nora returned home. The sun was setting over the pasture. The grass glowed green beneath the golden light. The original 21 cows moved slowly across the field alongside their descendants. They were healthy, calm, strong, and no longer invisible. Nora leaned against the fence. She remembered the auctioneer's silence, the laughter, the comments about slaughter. She remembered buying cattle everyone else considered worthless. But the greatest transformation wasn't that the cows had gained weight. It was that the land had gained life. The pasture no longer needed to be forced into productivity. It was becoming productive because it was being managed as a living system. And the same cows everyone had dismissed became the animals that helped reveal what the land could become. The critics had gone quiet, not because Nora had defeated them, but because the pasture spoke louder than they ever could.